including the emerging ghost forest phenomenon in Alligator River, in contrast to the higher elevation reference stands in the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. He'll present evidence that isolates the cause of death as either inundation or salt for this globally threatened ecosystems. Co-authors of this work and presentation include Kendal Earley and Dr. Robert Atkinson. Following that presentation, we'll take questions, and then Dr. Doug DeBerry, Assistant Research Professor, will continue on. Doug is a senior scientist at VHB, and in a multi-year study of plant invasion on compensatory wetland and stream mitigation sites, he and a graduate student, Dakota Hunter, evaluated the most important factors structuring vegetation communities when invaders are present, sampled vegetation and environmental parameters across invasion gradients at multiple sites. This is in the coastal plain and Piedmont physiographic provinces of Virginia. And the results of this research have been used to develop recommendations for ecological performance standards, as well as a suite of best practices that can be implemented at the outset of a stream or wetland mitigation project to reduce the risk of invasion. So the webinar, again, is hosted with VHB using Zoom, and we appreciate that. And I'd like to hand over the presentation to Mitchell Doyle. Please take it away.
Yeah, no worries. Good afternoon. My name is Mitchell Doyle, and I'll start sharing my screen. Share screen. Cool. Good afternoon. This is a project that we've been working on for a good bit now with Kendal Earley, who's currently a senior in the Center for Wetland Conservation, and Dr. Rob Atkinson, my thesis advisor. Salt or inundation, how is sea level rise stressing Atlantic White Cedar trees and forming ghost forest in the mid-Atlantic region? And I'm going to turn off my video so we might be able to save a bit of bandwidth. Cool. So first, our study site. Our study tree, Atlantic White Cedar, Chamiciferous dioides. It has this really wide historic range, as this left image shows. Historically, it would have gone from southern Maine all the way down the Atlantic coast into the Gulf portion of Florida, and then over a bit into these other areas. But its current range is much less into these pockets of mid-Atlantic and upper mid-Atlantic areas. It's a responsive conifer, meaning as it grows, it records fairly well local environmental conditions, as well as climatic variables and changes in its surrounding environment. And importantly, it's an obligate wetland hydrophyte. So this right image is a Atlantic White Cedar stand in Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And you can see the sphagnum moss and these young trees that are growing and self-thinning as they make their way through life. And once again, very good climate record for these trees for their area and the ecosystem that they're in. However, habitat loss is a huge concern with Atlantic White Cedar ecosystem. The peatlands, they all occur in that first 20 to 30 miles of the Atlantic coast, which means as colonization occurred, they were there for easy harvest and use. As early as the mid 1700s, a traveling botanist by the last name of Calm notes, as he goes through Pittsburgh and other large cities along the East Coast and a bit more inland, that Atlantic White Cedar is disappearing, and the residents of those towns and cities are complaining that they're having to turn to what they see as more inferior trees, such as bald cypress or eastern red cedar, for their shingling, for their barrel making, for their ship production. Atlantic White Cedar was used in these industries because of its incredible lightweight, and it was very weather resistant. What that means is that the Atlantic White Cedar that remains is in primarily drained areas that were converted for land, for agriculture as they went along. This right image is from Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, and it shows some Atlantic White Cedar shingles that they still source and use for their upkeep of their historic buildings and for their reshingling efforts. So stress, the big question we have: salt or inundation? Inundation is the more common form of stress in Atlantic White Cedar systems. Water comes in and hypoxic soil conditions occur that reduce growth. The undisturbed systems like Alligator River is, or mostly is I undergo this seasonally flooded saturated condition. And as a result of it being the most historic form of stress for this species, the species has developed some adaptations to compensate. The main adaptation being that it can selectively form parenchyma from its roots to its stems by producing ethylene. And this allows for oxygen diffusion to the roots. So it helps lessen and relieve the stress that Atlantic white cedar undergoes. On the other side of the coin is salt. This comes in the form of salinized soil, which increases stress through osmotic and or ionic toxicity. So more sodium, more chloride in the system, or the water being more salt dense. The species relies on external sources of relief for this generally. That can come, we think, in the form of dilution from regular precipitation events, bringing more water into the system and reducing this ionic and osmotic stress that Atlantic white cedar is undergoing potentially. So looking at our study sites, our first study site is Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. It sits on the Dare County Peninsula in North Carolina, between the Albemarle Sound to the north and the Pamlico Sound to the south. The Outer Banks are just to the east, and of course, on the other side of the Outer Banks, the Atlantic Ocean. It's 61,000 hectares of fish and wildlife land, and of that, little under 3,000 hectares are Atlantic white cedar, mainly in the central points around Milltail Creek and Sawyer Lake. It's very close to sea level. The average elevation across Alligator River is only about 1 meter. And of course, geographically, it's also very close to the sea as well, sitting here on this peninsula. Ghost forests have become an emerging issue for Alligator River, mainly along its northern portion in that large red circle, and then in the inner portions of the refuge near Sawyer Lake, which is that smaller circle down here to the south, which is just north of Milltail Creek, which runs from the Alligator River into the central portions of the refuge itself. It's a ghost forest because the trees that are left standing are ghosts of the forest that used to be there. They are standing dead wood and no longer producing biomass and growing. The two set of sites that we have for Alligator River are Doyle sites, which are sites that I collected from with other students in the lab in 2018. It's Alligator River 4, 6, and 7, which sit all along Milltail Creek. They were cored in 2018. And then there's Mary Sites, which was a graduate student in the lab in the early 2000s. She cored at what we're calling Alligator River 5 for our study. And these were done in 2003 and 2004. Our other site, the sites in what we might end up being a reference area, is Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. So this is in Southeast Virginia. It sits on the North Carolina-Virginia border. It's a bit smaller than Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge at only 44,000 hectares of forested peatland, but it does still have roughly the same acreage of Atlantic white cedar forests. In contrast to Alligator River, it's a good bit from the Atlantic Ocean, about 45 kilometers, so 25 or so miles. And it's also situated much further above sea level, 2 to 3 meters versus Alligator River's 1 meter. This means that Great Dismal Swamp might provide a good reference site, as we're certain that it's not undergoing sea level rise and won't undergo sea level rise for a good bit of this century. The Patterson sites are the collection of 11 sites that were collected in 2003, just south of Lake Drummond and Great Dismal Swamp. They were part of a salvage logging expedition after Hurricane Isabel came through. And for a sense of what those sites looked like at that time after all of that blowdown, there's that that lower picture of Great Dismal Swamp's salvage sites that Craig Patterson took when he was doing his thesis research in the lab in 2003 and 2004 for this collection. So a bit of our methods. Our cores and our samples come to us in two types. The Patterson collection is all cross sections that were collected from these tree blowdowns, and he went around each of these cross sections and recorded 3 to 5 radial lines, which is this blue circle, to get a good idea of the variability of the tree rings for that tree and cut down on that inter-tree variability and growth. 106 trees in total in his collection. The Mary and Doyle collections are increment cores. So these are done on a north-south line and then an east-west line to also help cut down on that variability that we have within a tree. And it's roughly 110 trees. We took these trees and we divided them into 2 time series groups. And we did this using the average midpoint for the average age of all of our trees. And that falls around 1971/1972. The early grouping is 1895 to 1971, and Great Dismal Swamps sites, the Patterson collection is a bit younger by about 30 or so years than the Doyle and Mary trees. So it only goes from 1919 to 1971 in that early grouping. And then the late grouping, the late time series is 1972 to 2018, which is when we most recently collected Atlantic White Cedar cores in Alligator River. For Great Dismal Swamp, because of the blowdown from the hurricane in 2003, it only goes until 2003. On the right, we have a map, we have a graphic of the sea level rise for Sewell's Point, Virginia, which is where the James River empties into the Chesapeake Bay. And it's about even geographically with Great Dismal Swamp, though it's much further east than Great Dismal Swamp is, of course. And this yellow line that divides it is a visual depiction of that dividing early and late time series. So we can see in that early time series, sea level rise is a bit lower, and as expected, sea level rise is increasing. So it's becoming more severe in this later time series grouping that we have. On the climate side of data, so not the growth side of data, we have the Palmer Drought Severity Index as what we use to correlate against growth. It's a measurement of precipitation and temperature for an area to determine the relative dryness or degree of drought that an area is undergoing. This image is from March PDSI for 2021 in the US. You can see the Southwest, a bit of a drought with the more reds, while the Mid-Atlantic, it's a bit wetter with these blues. So higher PDSI values for the Mid-Atlantic right now and a bit lower PDSI values for the Southwest. The reason we use PDSI itself, though, as opposed to some other climate variable or climate index, is that it's shown to correspond fairly well to tree growth. Trees tend to be responsive to precipitation, to relationships between precipitation and temperature, which PDSI collects and simulates very, very well. The way that we took this climate data and turned it into something that was usable with these tree rings is through the building of a 24-month window. So this is looking at everything from the PDSI value in the previous January to the PDSI value in the current December. So what we found out, a bit of results and discussions. So there's a lot going on this graphic, of course, and we're gonna walk through it. The y-axis is the correlation estimate from a Spearman rank correlation we did between PDSI values and our detrended growth curves from our Alligator River collections. The x-axis is that previous January through current December time series window. Green is the late estimates, so that's the 1972 to 2018 time series, while early is that early estimate, the 1895 to 1971 time series. And we see a very interesting pattern here. The stronger correlations are in the previous years. So this might be a bit counterintuitive, but sometimes trees can have energy inputs that they then save due to stress to use in later years. So energy from previous years can then be used in the current year for growth. There's a bit of a downtrend in the correlations we see in current June, May, sorry, we see in the sort of some of the rainier months of the year. And that could be because as water comes into the system, inundation begins to outcompete potentially salt competition that's present. The big takeaway from this graphic, though, is the flip that we see for the early time series estimate. almost all of the correlations are negative, while for the late estimate, almost all of them are positive, and especially positive in that previous year comparison. What this means is that for the early estimate, the PDSI was, as PDSI increased, growth decreased. So more rain, less growth, less rain, more growth. For the late estimate, the opposite. Higher PDSI, higher precipitation led to more growth in the system. For Great Dismal Swamp, we have a bit of a different story. We still have this 24-month window. The y-axis is still the same as the correlation estimate. The late and early groupings are still the same, though Great Dismal Swamp is a bit younger in its tree cores. So once again, that early estimate is 1919 to 1971, and that late estimate is 1972 to 2003. Great Dismal Swamp's undergone a bit of drainage historically, and as a result, it's more responsive to and sensitive to growth, to drought conditions in the present year of growth. So as conditions change for Great Dismal Swamp due to its inflow and outflow, the growth condition, the growth responses change as well. So we're going to focus mainly on the current year growth, since trees at Great Dismal Swamp tend to use their photosynthate as soon as they get it. For the current year, we see that there's strong positive correlations between PDSI and growth, meaning higher, more rain in, more growth, and we see that for both the early and the late estimates. So the difference here between what potentially is our reference site of Great Dismal Swamp versus our study site of Alligator River is that at Alligator River, there's something different going on. Alligator River has that flip, while Great Dismal Swamp doesn't have that flip. So the big question that we started with, and I will finish a bit with, is it inundation or is it salt at Alligator River? And we think it's a bit of both. Early, that early growth area, that 1895 to 1971, we think inundation is what's sort of winning out as the stress condition that the Atlantic White Cedar is undergoing. As PDSI increases, the amount of growth decreases. So more water, more inundation, more stress, less growth. On the other side, when we see the late correlation flip for that late grouping to the 1971 to 2018, it seems like something else is winning out. And we think it's most likely salt from rising sea levels, as well as the storms that can bring in that sea level through some of the canals and ditches that Alligator River has. So in this case, salt's winning out. And that might be what explains that flip. Alligator River is salt stressed, and at least in our trees, we think in that late period, which is why now increased precipitation leads to more growth. The salt gets flushed from the system in a way, or it gets desalinized a bit. And one way Alligator River itself has dealt with this is through these one-way water control structures. So they keep salt out on one side with one-way flow gates, and they keep inundation at a manageable level on the left in this case through allowing one-way flow. So I'd like to thank CNU's Office of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity for funding, and then for funding some of our undergraduate students to work with us on this project, the Center for Wetland Conservation for providing the materials, the lab space, the ability to go out into the field, for Fish and Wildlife Service for the ability to collect cores and do interviews and get a good sense of what these sites are, and then of course the Department of Organismal and Environmental Biology. And of course, y'all as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions that have come up.
Great, thank you, Mitchell. We do have some questions coming in, and we've got time for them, which is great. So if other folks do have questions, please use the Q&A feature. The first question I've got is, could you remind us the early and late, how did you decide the year to divide that by?
Yeah, of course. The early and late, we went through and we looked at the average length of our time series. So all of our cores vary in their ages, but their average age and then the midpoint for that average age. So that came at that 1971, 1972. It felt like the least biased way to help divide our data into potentially an early and late grouping.
Great, thank you. The next question that's coming, oh, there you are, Lexi, go ahead.
Oh, cool.
All right, we have a question in our Q&A tab. First question is, does it seem like the Atlantic White Cedar has more morphological or physiological adaptations to deal with inundation or salt? That should provide context to which stressor the Atlantic White Cedar is historically adapted to. Seems like they are more adapted to inundation, and that inundation has been the more common historic disturbance. Wondering if salt becomes the major stressor, would that lead to more rapid or severe degradation?
Definitely. Atlantic White Cedar is certainly better handled to deal with inundation as its main form of stress, and that's partly because it's a wetland species and it has the ability to form that parenchyma through the release of ethylene in its roots and get some oxygen down to its roots to continue growing and surviving as a species. Definitely with the addition of salt, there is that we think that rapid and severe degradation, which might be what's contributing to the emergence of ghost forests within Alligator River and other parts of the mid-Atlantic, is that the rapidness of salinization and saltwater intrusion is just outpacing anything that Atlantic White Cedar has to deal with it.
Thank you. Another question is to protect either of these types of disturbances, either salt or inundation. Is anyone doing that already, or what could be done to protect this rare globally threatened ecosystem?
Yeah, there's definitely things in place for both. One is that one-way. Oh, there we go. Is that one-way water control structures? I know Alligator River has these. They were installed, I think, in 2014 or 2015. And what they do, Alligator River has some other management goals, most likely as due to its large size. Can you all see my cursor? I'm sorry, I should have asked that before.
Yes, it's a little light on the white background, but on the pipe, I can see your.
Cool. Yep, I'm just gonna trace it on the pipe in this case. These are one-way valves, so they allow for the water from inundation, from an inundation stress, whether it's increased by a rain event, to flow out while saltwater is limited in its ability to flow into the system through this one-way valve that exists at the other end of the pipe. I'm not too certain how many Alligator River has, but I do think that Great Dismal Swamp has some similar water control structures that allow for one-way water flow.
And then one other question is the rate of peat accumulation, could that be a way to mitigate, or how does the rate of peat accumulation play into this story, I guess would be the question.
Yeah. Peat accumulation is notoriously slow. I don't know if notorious is the right word now that I've said it. Peat accumulation is certainly very slow, and it's not more rapid than the current levels of sea level, than the current rate of sea level rise that we're seeing. Peat accumulates at very, very incrementally slow rates. New peat formation is, of course, always ongoing, so there is a slight bit of mitigation, but at least for Alligator River, due to its initially being so close to sea level rise anyway, peat accumulation probably is not going to be a useful method for mitigation.
We've got one more question in the Q&A panel. Lexi, did you want to grab that one? You're welcome to.
Yes, I'll read the last question that we have. Does the Atlantic White Cedar have any niche ecological roles that make them ecologically important. Our viewer is assuming they are cornerstone in their habitat type, and the habitat type is exceedingly more rare, which has downstream effects on a whole host ecosystem organisms. He's wondering if the Atlantic White Cedar provides any specific services we can point to highlight their importance.
Atlantic White Cedar is fairly long-lived. There's been Atlantic White Cedar that have been pulled out of peat bogs in the Northeast that are more than 600 years old. So they provide a good long-term store of carbon. They're also important for landscape diversity as well. They provide they're just simply another forest type and another peatland ecosystem type than what might be dominant in a region.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. I think that's all the questions that we've got for today. And we're right at 12:30, which is wonderful. And Doug, if you are able to take it away, we'd love to hear your presentation.
All right, let me just come on screen to say hello to everybody. There we go. Yes, nice to see everybody. And thank you, of course, VAWP. Thanks, Katie and Matt, all of the affiliates with VAWP, Alexi, Ben, Brian, for setting this up. I've said on many occasions, these are among my favorite public forums for the types of things that concern us all. So I think VAWP really does an amazing job of hosting these things, and happy to participate. Thanks, Mitchell, for the great presentation on that important research on Atlantic White Cedar that you're doing with Rob. Great intel there. And again, thanks to VHB for hosting. I'm going to share my screen and pull up a presentation that, if you will, is sort of a continuation of one that I started the last time I was in front of this group, which was a couple of years ago. And I'm going to go off screen. Sorry, just one second. But at any rate, while I figure out how to go off screen, I was in front of this group speaking about pretty much just an update on research that we had ongoing at William and Mary. And at that time, a graduate student named Dakota Hunter had been working on his master's thesis in this category of invasive species and compensatory mitigation. And we're using that term compensatory mitigation to mean wetlands and streams. Although a lot of our research was in mitigation banks, we also had project sites that were in lieu fee, the in lieu fee program, and also some permittee responsible mitigation. So we're looking at a broad range of sites, and the enterprise was extended to stream banks in 2018. So what I'm going to present to you now is the conclusion of that research. And that comes under the auspices of this report here, which is the digital ink is literally still wet on this thing. It was just turned into the grantor resource protection group earlier this week. So you're getting fresh research info here, and hopefully a good review of what we're looking at. I am going to present the information from this study in about the order of operations that you see there, starting with some background. I hope that you'll indulge a sort of what I'll call a speed round of background information and lit review, even though the most important part of this is the results from our research. I feel like it's very, very important to lay the foundation for some of the what we might say just the relative ecology of invaders in these systems. And I'll hasten to mention that this entire project, which was about a 3-year study that morphed into 4 years, for all sorts of reasons, pandemics and hurricanes and faulty greenhouse HVAC systems, which I'll talk about later. But this whole process sort of started with a discussion with Mike Rollband of the Resource Protection Group, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And really appreciate his input on this and his diligence in making it happen. So of course, this research is funded by the Resource Protection Group. And I'll mention that again later. So that's the trajectory, and that discussion was sort of the start of this project. But in a sense, I've been thinking about this for a long time, my interest in this topic of invasion ecology certainly started way back in the early 90s when I was beginning my career in environmental consulting. And a lot of the folks who are on the call I know have a similar dossier of experiences. The way I think of this is sort of a mental Rolodex. So you're building up site knowledge from all these different regions that you work in. And Virginia is wonderful because we have this diversity of physiographic provinces and different types of habitats. So in my mental Rolodex, I've always kind of cached this idea of invasion ecology and wondered why, when I look at one site that is ostensibly the same as another with respect to what environmental variables, we might say. So it seems like the same type of hydrology regime. It seems like the same type of relative elevation. The soil type seems the same. But yet there seems to be a difference in the invasibility of these sites. One site is invaded, the other isn't. And so that's the kind of curiosity that led me to think about ways to look at this research. And I'll also point out that my posture over the years has changed out in the field, but I still am motivated. So fast forward to the doctoral work I did with Jim Perry, and I do want to mention that a lot of what I present here is going to reflect the things that I learned from Jim Perry and his very influential research at VIMS in this field of wetland mitigation. But this was an example of a project site in Northern Virginia that was part of a 15-site study on community ecology and wetland mitigation back in the early 2000s. And what is sort of featured in this photo is a dominance of cattails in the background, and in the foreground, although probably a bit pixelated, you can see this sort of different community type here. And that's all Lespedeza cuneata, which you might call Sericea lespedeza. So these two highly invasive and problematic species. In fact, they rank as the highest invaders in the state by virtue of DCR's ranking process, are on this site, and they're dominant. And yet what we were finding is that on sites like this, species richness was highest. Actually, on this site, our species richness values in our data sets were highest. And so that was a curiosity to me. And if you superimpose that idea of what's happening at these kind of zones where you've got the influence of invaders, but maybe not completely overwhelmed sites, we have this idea of a standard or a performance standard for invasion. And although I recognize that it tends to vary depending on the permit or the mitigation banking instrument that's used and approved, 5% has historically been the Virginia target for invasive species performance. And then in the intervening years between then and now, as I was catching up to some of the literature on this topic, I noticed that although there is a lot of ancillary research, in other words, research that's done in mitigation but not focused on invaders, we don't have any applied research that just focuses on invasion gradients. And I'll define invasion gradient in a second, but those things were sort of preeminent in my thinking about how to move forward with this type of study. Also, in the sort of the background information, we know, as most people do on this call, that if you have a performance standard and you don't meet the performance standard, then you're compelled to treat for the performance standard through remediation. And of course, in Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic, that typically comes in the flavor of herbicide and mostly non-selective herbicide use, particularly for high levels of invasion. And that's probably appropriate. It seems to be the most effective way to what you might say do retroactive remediation when you have invaders on sites. And as many of you know who are in this particular area of the industry, for mitigation banks, your credit releases are tied to performance, and for permitting responsible mitigation, permit compliance is tied to performance. So you're out of compliance if you're out of performance on these mitigation sites. So we see indiscriminate killing, and again, I'm not saying it's not justified. What we want to know really is what's a target for flipping into this particular type of management strategy. If you're thinking about targets and you're thinking about this idea of performance, you can look around the country and get some ideas from different regulatory programs. And as I mentioned, this is my own experience, but 5% has historically been the target for Virginia. A study down in Florida looked at a lot of different mitigation, well, we'll just say standard criteria for mitigation sites and also mitigation banking instruments, and found a range of 1 to 10%. So that's a pretty broad range to look at abundance for invaders on sites and tying performance to it. Michigan was 10% back in the 20-teens. Washington had a very comprehensive review within its state program through its Department of Ecology, and 10% was their threshold. Then we have some other ones that are kind of more species specific. So Ohio at one point had a 5% non-cattail target. And if you're wondering why that is, in Ohio, they sort of acknowledge that it's very difficult to tease out the differences between latifolia and angustifolia, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the hybrid between them, which is X. glauca. So they said if it's 5%, it'll apply to non-typha species, but for cattails, they'll throw a 10%. And then in other conditions in Ohio, the language is just predominantly native. So that is the criterion, is that you just want predominantly native without really a definition of what predominantly means. So that's a tough one to target. And in Maryland, again, it's very clear what the target for this one is. Phragmites is probably the biggest problem, at least in the eastern part of the state, or other nuisance species. So they're probably categorically looking at species that are ranked by their how aggressive they are on sites. And then lastly, again, this is just a snapshot of programs, but North Carolina brought this term functional integrity into their mitigation banking instrument template. And that's an interesting idea, because what we ultimately should be motivated to do is to tie performance to function. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so if you take that information at face value and assume that the lower end of those targeted scales, like 1 to 5%, is appropriate, what we have discovered, at least in the lit review component of this study, is that it's not necessarily supported by the literature in all cases. And I'll just bring up to your attention a few examples: cattails, arthraxin, which is a problematic species in Virginia, Lespedeza, which I mentioned earlier, and Japanese stiltgrass, which is microstegium that confounds everybody, how to figure out what to do with that one. And then we have the Mordania, which is becoming more problematic on wetter sites. But you don't necessarily find statements in the lit review that I've cited here that say these species do not affect this, but you can read into the data that higher levels of richness, higher levels of diversity tend to occur when you get these moderate levels of these species present. In some circumstances on these sites. So it's a thought, and what we want to do is we want to tease out the dynamics that are related to that and find out if we actually have that going on in Virginia as well. Ultimately, if you look at management, again, we're thinking compulsory management. So if we set a performance standard and don't meet it, we have to go out and kill the non-natives. And what the research has shown us is that over time, if with repeated herbicide treatment, there are all kinds of synergistic problems that relate to soil chemistry, but we also noticed that ultimately repeated herbicide treatment is an open door to facilitate reinvasion of these sites. So this is a picture that was taken by my former graduate student now, Dakota Hunter, and this is an example of that, a sort of exemplary of the situation where you kill one invader, that's the cattail, in the above ground, the dead standing above ground material, and then the invasion that's happening underneath is the species Mordania. So we have that as sort of the backdrop, if you will, to the research program, and ultimately what we're gearing towards is these specific questions. We want to know, how do invasive species impact functions, and specifically functions that relate to vegetation communities, because it's the treatment of species seems to be linked to the performance of vegetation on mitigation sites. The second question is, are there standards out there that can then be aligned to our first question? And or are the current, what we might quote unquote current performance standards appropriate? That's fine. We want to find that out as well. And then the third question is, what are the sort of environmental drivers of invasion on these sites? Going back to my first statement, if you have two, at face value, if you have two sites that are at least apparently the same, what tips the scale in the favor of invasion on the one site versus the other? So that's an interesting question to ask. And then the fourth question is, out of all of this, are there then best practices that can be implemented mostly at the front end of a project so that we're being proactive instead of continually having to be retroactive or to come after the fact and remediate these issues? So that's what we're going for. So again, stepping through the process, and I'm going to speed up just a little bit through this stuff because I've already talked about it in a previous lecture to this group, but I do want to touch base on it. Anyone who's interested in the literature on this, we have posted an annotated bibliography through Resource Protection Group, and there's their link down there, so you can go to that website and you can pull this down. It's about 45 or 50 pages of an annotated bib on research that is completely or directly related to this question of invasion and mitigation. So yeah, there you go. Perfect cure for insomnia for anybody who has that issue going on. But it is a good document that is searchable for keywords, and so we've done the work. So if you need anything to support some of the things that you're thinking about in this category, we encourage you to pull that down and take a look at it. Wetlands and stream systems, I'll just point this out, are particularly susceptible to invasion compared to terrestrial habitats. And the main reason why is because when you look at the sequence of invasion, introduction, establishment, and dominance, at each one of those stages, wetlands and streams tend to kind of have more of an open door to these invaders. They're at a topographic position lower in the landscape, so propagules, seeds, and so forth are going to find it kind of more easy, you would say, to distribute and get into these systems. And particularly for streams, so you have a unidirectional flow and you have a watershed contributing everything, including all the organic matter, all the seeds, any rhizomes that can still root and take hold. Lots of nutrients, so we have this whole resource availability thing going on. And then we also have disturbance, which I'll talk about in a minute. So just as an example, Joy Zedler has done a lot of research in this category, and here's an example of a line sketch up top that shows sort of the invasion sequence, if you will, when conditions change. So here's a sedimentation issue up there at the top, time sequence, and then you get this sort of monotype. And this you might call an alternate stable state. Okay, so this was the functional state where you have microtopography, and then this is the alternate state where you just have a monotype. And an example from Dakota Hunter, this is Lithium, which is purple loosestrife, and you can see the effective watershed. So there's the James River watershed, and every dot represents its presence in a county within that watershed, certainly getting in and down through the watershed by virtue of that conduit. And I really want everybody to focus on this for 30 seconds. Very, very important. If nothing else, what is most compelling to us from the literature on invasion is this idea of stress and disturbance and how they work together to create invasion. And again, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but it's important to differentiate between the two concepts. So stress to an ecologist is some factor that causes a negative physiological response and results in a reduction in fitness or growth. So you can think of stress as to plants as things like nutrient limitation, salt stress, or light limitation is another one, drought, like low water availability. Those are all stressful conditions. And by contrast, a disturbance is any change that results in a removal of biomass. So the usual suspects, floods, fires, some sort of atmospheric anomaly like a tornado, or if you like, a bulldozer, human activities in landscapes. And what we know from some of the theory, including the work by Philip Grime in the UK and then Connell in the 70s, suggests to us that if you are thinking about plant strategies, we have actually 3 thoroughgoing strategies for plants out there in at least in our region, in the temperate North American region. The competitive strategy, which is one which is annotated as C here, refers to something that's really good at stable habitats. They can compete. The ruderal habitat or habit or condition is one that is typically used by weedy species, so things that can get in after a disturbance, but they're not very good at competing. And then we have this other one that Philip Grime added to the list, which is stress tolerators. And it seems like if you have a higher occurrence of these things, you tend to not have invaders. And the reason why that is because if you superimpose this idea of disturbance, where you have sort of a moderate level of disturbance in this hypothesis here accords with a higher diversity of species present on the landscape. And then you combine that with this sort of stress disturbance concept, you get this summary, which is, I think, one of the best models that's out there for this idea. It came from Alpert in 2000. But the disturbance on the y-axis and stress on the x-axis, at an intermediate level of disturbance, you get higher richness. And the more stressful you get out there in the environment, the less likely you are to have invaders. And that's because invaders tend to prefer disturbed habitats with lots of resources. They're not very good at competing at low resource availability. Again, thinking about the types of things that stress out plants, like nutrients, light, and so forth too. So keep that in the back of your mind. We'll think about it. And of course, look at a typical mitigation project. The types of activities that are required to build a mitigation site are absolutely the types of things that disturb habitats. So the doors open, on these mitigation sites, it's just kind of a consequence of the practice that we know. And then on the stress side of things, floodplains, if a mitigation site's on a former agricultural landscape, all of these things tend to incur lots of nutrient availability. And we open up the canopy when we oftentimes are doing restoration, and particularly in stream systems. So it allows light in, and that reduces stress for a lot of species that are light limited. And then you can look at hydrology as well. Of course, the big stress for hydrology is dissolved oxygen or availability of atmospheric oxygen for respiration, but there are other factors as well. So we have these two things going on. And what I have in the back of my mind is, if you could, it sounds weird, but if you can impose stress, recognizing that disturbance is a factor, if you could impose stress on these ecosystems, perhaps there's a way to sort of manage for this. Okay, so to the field study, we had two sort of phases of this field study. There was the wetland phase and the stream phase. I'll go through the wetland phase first, and the stream phase you'll see will basically come in step. But we screened a bunch of sites, picked about 24 to look at. Excuse me, and we were looking at, in the first instance, about 5 species and settled on 3. And the reason why the other 2 weren't selected is because, and you can see down there at the bottom, it was Murdani and Phalaris. We just didn't find enough distribution and abundance on the sites we were looking at. But our target species are Athraxin, Hispidus, Microstegium viminium, and Typha. And we use this sort of an all-in perspective for Typha because, again, an homage almost to Ohio, but they're tough to kind of classify when you get into the hybridization of cattails. So think of latifolia, angustifolia, and the hybrid as within our domain for our research group. Sites are sort of evenly distributed across the coastal plain in Piedmont and Virginia, actually almost exactly split between those 2 physiographic provinces. But the real challenge we have is trying to figure out how in the world to do this invasion gradient idea. If you go into the center of a population, so here's the invaded population, which I'll show you there. You got, pretty much the completely invaded into the gradient. We were trying to figure out a way to randomize the plot location without jumping out of the population, which could happen. And if you just did a random grid sample across a site, you would, invariably you'll end up with one plot that's let's take a wetland, for example, up on a side slope, and another plot that's down in a pond. And even though that would be definitely, you'd see environmental variation between those 2 plots, it would be sort of unmeaningful, if you will, because everybody can recognize those are different conditions. We want the condition that's somewhat similar across this gradient, at least apparently similar. So again, that tips the scale thing. What is tipping the scale in favor of these invaders? So we use this sort of randomization procedure where we basically we set up a 4 meter square grid, so with 9 vertices, you can see them there. And at each grid, we selected a random number between 1 and 9, and that gave us the vertex that was going to be the center of the plot. In this case, it would be 6. Then we looked at the direction, all the possible compass coordinates or compass directions that could define a transect that would lead out into an area of the site that was similar. Again, using the same idea, we want to sample something that's similar, at least apparently, in terms of environmental condition. So that direction was randomly determined using a compass heading. And then once we got that direction, the intersection between that transect, or that, we'll just call that direction, and the edge of the population was another grid that was basically subjected to another random vertex draw. And then the rest of the plots were aligned in sequence after that, having been randomized. So that was the approach. And again, that was, it took us a while to figure this out, but it was vetted through all kinds of experts, Bob Pete down at UNC, and a lot of our colleagues at William and Mary, and biostatisticians, Jim Perry, several discussions with Wes Hudson from the Corps of Engineers, definitely helpful in that regard. EPA too, we talked to Teresa McGee and Mary Cantula because of their important research on the National Wetland Condition Assessment and the VEG methods used there. So this was our approach, and what we were looking at per plot was first of all abundance. So everything within a meter square was documented using cover class scales, and we did a meter square in each one of these quadrants of a 4 meter square plot and averaged the 4, which we found to be, I think, a lot more comprehensive than the typical meter square approach. We sampled soils, we did field texturing of soil, and then sent our samples off to Virginia Tech for lab analysis. Most of the macronutrients, some micronutrients, pH, and carbon were analyzed. And then for canopy cover, we took a hemispheric photo at each plot, the center of each plot, approximately 1 meter above the ground for the lower species. And then for typho, we went up 2 meters because we needed to avoid the self-shading concept. And then we used basically an image processing software to determine based on pixels what the cover was. It's pretty straightforward. Now here's a look at the statistics. I won't go into these because we're going to run out of time, but the key thing is that we're looking at community properties, including composition, native species richness, floristic quality index, which if folks don't know about that, I'm happy to provide more intel on that. And then also how species accumulate, how sites accumulate species, and the diversity profiles help us to rank sites. And we're thinking about sites in terms of these plots. So the invaded to the uninvaded end of this gradient. That's our invasion gradient. We looked at environmental correlation using rank orders, which it sounds like Mitchell did the same thing with his work. I like rank order correlation because it pretty much preserves the linear relationships, and you can also get monotonic relationships, which is you can find out if there's a nonlinear relationship, do you still yet have a positive correlation between things, or negative, if you will. Okay. And then community modeling. So we're thinking about how the entire community or the structure of the community behaves in the presence of these invaders. So that was CCA, which I have a lot of experience with, and we did model selection using Akaiki's information criterion. So for all you R nerds out there, the version was 4.0.3, which is annotated as Bunny Oney's Freak Out. And I don't know how to explain that one other than that's what it is. So, okay, results, most important part. Here's what we found. In the wetland studies, composition, and when I say composition, I mean just the identity of the things that are present, not necessarily their relative abundances, but what things are there. It only seemed to be affected at the highest levels of invasion. And so I put the gradient up here at the top, A, B, C, and D. A is the invaded in, C is the edge, if you will, and then E is the uninvaded. And you'll notice that, first of all, this matrix over here shows that none of these values are really close to 0, which would indicate different or not similar. And none of these values are close to 1 either, which would indicate completely the same. So we have this sort of in between area, and we looked at in a more detailed way at similarity by use of analysis of similarity, which is ANOSIM. And that differentiated things for us. And you'll notice that down here, the invaded end of the gradient, A and B, tended to be the most different And again, a better way to say that is the least similar to the rest of the sites. And these all pretty much overlap with between plot variation. So we're looking at similarity between moderately invaded, which is the C group up here, this edge, and then the uninvaded ends of the gradient. So that's interesting. Then we looked at native richness, floristic quality, and diversity. And what we found there was that it turns out that middle dominance area, so I'm calling the moderately invaded areas, and I'll just say that's probably around 5 to 10% with these invaders, actually had the highest levels of species richness, and most importantly, native species richness, floristic quality, and then also diversity. And you can measure diversity using these Renier profiles, which are pretty interesting. But that green line that you see in the graph down in the bottom left-hand corner corresponds to this middle plot here, this edge environment, the moderately invaded. And the same thing with these accumulation curves. All these two graphs mean is that if you can track this one group at the top level of this gradient all the way across, it is the most diverse. That's what it means. Which was a surprise, really, that you could have the presence of an invader right there in the center, and then have, again, these values. Okay. Of interest, the environmental variation component, we were trying to, again, tease out what things were sort of driving, from an environmental standpoint, driving these sites toward invasion. And as you could probably well expect, hydrology was highly correlated with the abundance of all of our data sets. And canopy cover too, which was something that was kind of expected, but we didn't think it would show up in all three of these invasion data sets. And then other things that showed up in these CCA biplots. The way to read these, by the way, is the green circles are the plots, and the larger the circle, the higher the abundance of the invader for that plot. So this one's for microstegium, and then we have a lot of invasion down here and less invasion up here. So when you look at the arrow for hydrology here, it's negatively correlated, if you will, with the abundance of the invader. You can see those trends around here. And then we found that the usual suspects, nitrogen and phosphorus, were important in structuring the communities. And then texture showed up as well, soil texture, which I'll talk about a little bit later. If you're interested in the direction of effect for arthraxin, hydrology tended to restrict arthraxin, so drier sites were better. Same thing for microstegium. On all three of our invaders, canopy cover restricted distribution. So shadier sites tended to be, I guess, less advantageous for the invaders. And then we had a few other things that related to soil physiochemistry. And of course, they sort of depend on the species. But in general, higher soil nutrient content tended to favor all three invaders. And lastly, hydrology tended to be positively correlated with cattails, which is probably something you would have expected. These species have convective through flow in the roots, so they can get oxygen down to those roots in those wetter habitats. Okay, I'm going to have to go a little bit quicker now for the streams, but that's okay. We've set the stage. Same type of study, different species, Lespedeza cuneata, Linisaura japonica, and microstegium. We actually picked microstegium for sure because it was present on a lot of these stream sites. So we have one species that's consistent across both the wetland and stream data sets. We looked at arthraxin, perilla, and sorghum, but we didn't choose those, again, for restrictions due to the data set. Even distribution of sites across coastal plain at Piedmont, same idea. Different approach to the transects, and the reason why is because if you use the single straight line transect in our example from the wetlands, you could end up on top of the ridge line. And that would be a completely different type of environmental condition than what we're looking at. So we use this randomization procedure with this sort of random vertex grid selection, and we fixed the distance away from the top of bank of the stream channel to set up the gradient that way. And then doing that, we were able to do pretty much the exact same thing, is monitor this gradient, this invasion gradient, but make sure that the environmental conditions, at least at face value, were similar across that gradient. That was our sampling strategy on the streams. Same data collected. The only difference is that wetland hydrology, which I forgot to mention before, hydrology was actually assessed using prevalence index. from the wetland study. In the stream study, we did not include wetland hydrology or wetness, if you will, because all of our sites were in upland floodplains. So we didn't look at wetland hydrology. Same statistical approaches to the streams. Okay, and the data were just shockingly the same. We found composition was really, again, here's one example using Lespedeza, only affected at these higher levels of invasion. And here's the gradient just up here at the top right-hand corner, just to remind you, A and B are the completely invaded and next to completely invaded site. C is the edge plot, and then these are the uninvaded D and E over on the right-hand side. So really a mirror image or a reflection, if you will, of the wetland data. And again, oddly enough, this sort of middle position, these C plots had the highest richness, native richness, the highest floristic quality index, and the highest, more or less, the highest diversity profiles. Again, that was a really kind of an interesting result. And we found a similar sort of cadre of important environmental variables, canopy cover being the most preeminent, in particular because it was correlated using the correlation test and also using these community model routines. Texture showed up as an important factor as well, and in our review of the data, it seems to signal localized disturbance. So I can talk a little bit more about that if there's time, but for the most part, the usual suspects, again, soil nutrient status and canopy cover, and then there are relationships. So again, the take home from the stream study is higher light availability favors all three invaders. And if you're thinking just now, how does that work with microstegium? Because it seems to be shade tolerant. The fact is that it actually tends to be shade limited up to a point, okay? Or beyond a point of shade, I should say. So when there is, and you probably have experienced this on your field sites, when there is a canopy opening, microstegium can really, really move in and take over. And that's the case for Lonicera as well. It tends to have this sort of modular expansion approach. So even though I say higher soil nutrient content and you see these negative values for variables like nitrogen, it turns out that some of these species, and actually all three of ours in this study, they have, you might say, autogenic control of the environment. So they can actually change nutrient pools in the sites that they invade. So the invasion is actually probably happening by virtue of higher nutrient availability. And then once these species get in, they tend to change that condition over time. For everyone's benefit, here is a look at how canopy cover changes. And I just picked a couple of sites from the wetland study. And if you just follow the invaded to uninvaded end of this trajectory, you'll see the canopy sort of closing up across those transects, which is pretty interesting. And here the stream study. So this is the type of thing that we were seeing, and it was evident to us when we were out in the field, but also evident in the numbers. Okay, I'm going to finish out here just by talking about performance standard, and then I'll do a quick study or review of our recommended best practices. But the question on the table is, what is, from our data, a recommended performance standard? And what we can tell, at least from our review of information at this level of sort of like this gradient, if you will, is that it's somewhere between this average or moderate condition of invasion, which is about 5 to 10%, and then what you might say next highest level of invasion. Here for the wetlands around 25, for the streams around 30%. There has to be some effect. There has to be some what you might see switch point where you start to see a change, and it's very hard to detect what that would be just from this type of information. So if we're looking for somewhere in the middle, what we did was we took a running mean of the native richness, which seemed to be reflective of all the other indicators. And then we map that as an XY scatter plot over top of the invasion gradient. So these are all of our invaders, and then you'll see this gradient here. The red line is the trend line for, not the trend line, sorry, it's the line connecting our invasion relative abundance of invaders. And in the case of the left graphs, the green line represents a third order polynomial regression over top of our scatter plots to give the visualize sort of where the changes are happening. And then the same for the streams over here. And what I did was I drew a line from the 10% threshold up to the invasion line. And you'll see at each one of these instances, you're either at the peak of richness, which is a good thing, or you're just on the downward slope as that native richness number tends to crash. So 10% is what we'd recommend, and based on our data. So that's really the results-based recommendation for a performance standard. And that, again, if you go back to some of the background information I gave you, it accords with what things are happening in other parts of the country. But now we seem to have a good set of data across, I hasten to mention, a lot of different growth forms and resource acquisition strategies. We have a couple of annual grasses. We've got a woody vine. We've got a pretty tall emergent perennial, and then a nitrogen fixing forb. So we have a lot of different species we've looked at. And I also want to point out, we had 2 different people doing this research. So it wasn't, the chances that there might have been some bias related to the way the data were collected were sort of off the table too. I thought about that as well. I'm thinking, gosh, this, how can you explain this stuff? So 10% relative abundance is our recommendation for that threshold. And we feel like that strikes a balance between the proactive management side of things and then the sort of indiscriminate loss of the desirable species when you're finding these sort of higher richness values around moderate levels of invasion. We want to also point out that what we've said is this should be interpreted based on data that are collected from ecological sampling theory practices. And it's very important to also demonstrate sample adequacy. So in my thinking of this, instead of doing an entire site invasive species performance standard, you would really track this at the level of a community type, because that's how you would be sampling your data across homogeneous community types. So I can talk more about that later if people are interested in it. And then what we've also recommended and really strongly encouraged is, in addition to tracking relative dominance of invaders, that you have in an annual invasive species mapping contingent to the review. And what that'll do is it'll identify any hotspots within a site where the relative abundance data might not be accounting for some things. Okay, so what the environmental drivers sort of led us to is some recommended best practices. And a lot of these things are intuitive to folks. There's certainly things that I learned through my career, but now we have, again, a good data set to support the use of these types of practices when you're developing these sites. First of all, plant larger trees. This was a little harder to do back in the 90s and in the 2000s because of the density requirement for performance standards for trees. Around 400 per acre was the typical requirement. And in order to meet that requirement, you had to plant a higher density of trees, and to make that affordable, you use smaller stock types. But now we have other methods to get at ecological performance, like the SAG, which is the stem area ground line, thanks to Wes Hudson and Jim Perry for that. So larger trees are actually going to probably create a more closed canopy scenario. And again, thinking about the shade as a controlling factor in the abundance of these species, a good strategy. We want to be able to do that without an undue expense, because larger trees, they're freaking expensive. So planting a bunch of those out there on site might be problematic. Although we still recommend higher density. So that's the second one, is planting at a higher density. And there, my thought is that from all I've learned from working and developing these sites over the years, making sure that the stock types and the material are sufficiently hardened at the nursery, and then also they're planted at the right time of year. We recommend a fall planting so that those species can overwinter and build those root systems. And early successional species is an interesting one too. So again, thinking about my own experiences in the 90s and the 2000s, a lot of our sites back then carried a requirement for oaks and other late successional species. But from our research, particularly the research I did with Jim Perry at VIMS, and we found that the sites tend to just using normal successional processes, they tend to let in these early successional species, and those are the ones that take over. But it's a good thing. If you look at this plant here, this is Salix nigra, so black willow. That plant is 3 years old, and it already has almost a 20-foot diameter canopy. And in the shade environment of this tree is really an advantageous planting zone for these later plants, these later successional species. So it functions as a nurse crop. That's kind of like our definition for nurse crop. And it really is a good strategy, and hopefully one that will be employed more frequently. And then think of it too is this: we're encouraging diversity, but we're also affecting a change potentially with these invaders. We said a higher and diverse seed mix was important. This is frankly an homage to the research in the early 90s. I can think of papers I was reading back then. So it's not a new idea or concept, but one that certainly fits with the data we're finding with these invaders. Make hydrology manipulable. What I mean by that is that even though we prefer the self-design approach, which is to build, to not over-engineer our mitigation sites, at least for wetland sites, the opportunity to modify hydrology seems to be really important in our ability to knock back some of the invaders of these species. And then I have here understand the stress disturbance dynamic. And the question here is, should we impose stress on these sites? And I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, and then as I said, map species annually. Finishing out here, sorry for hanging on, or thanks for hanging on, guys. I'm sorry for keeping everybody. I just want to mention we have ongoing work. We did have a thoroughgoing greenhouse study, but back in October, the HVAC system broke, and so we lost all of our plants, which was a big letdown. But I've got an undergraduate student named Sam. There he is in that picture, and he's been working with me. And research looks a lot different these days. We have the, I guess you might say, COVID safety responsible approaches here. But here's some recent pictures from our work that's ongoing. So hopefully we'll have our data back from that by June or July, and we'll be able to report in as an addendum to this, but that's ongoing. And what we want to do is we want to do field trials. And I put up here in the top right an image that I took from David Bailey, who was a grad student at VIMS back in the 2000s. But this is really a Lee Daniels type of study where you've got, it actually was one of his sites, where you've got this sort of randomized block design. And we see this as sort of a larger scale ecosystem study or empirical study where we can do different treatments. And the treatments that we're considering are, first of all, using, and this is interesting, high carbon to nitrogen ratio amendments. People are starting to look at this: sawdust, wood chips, things that are relatively cheap, so they're inexpensive to incorporate into the soil. But because you have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, as microbes are starting to oxidize those substrates, they are sort of starved of nitrogen, because it's got a low nitrogen value. And as they're trying to, again, build those amino acids, they'll be robbing the soil environment of bioavailable nitrogen from the plants. So that's a way to impose stress on these sites and potentially keep out these invaders that need that high resource availability. Another way to do that is to throw in metal oxides. And we're concerned a little bit about toxicity effects, but this has been done before in aquatic systems. Aluminum sulfide, which is alum, gets used quite frequently in lakes to immobilize phosphate. So that's something that we're thinking of doing, and then also including experimental plantings on some of these sites to just, again, effects of shade and so forth too, and tease those things out. Gosh, thank you guys. I didn't realize how long I'd gone. I'm so sorry, but thank you for sticking with me. And again, as I understand it, Resource Protection Group, who really we owe all of our thanks to for funding this research and providing review, Mike Molband, Jennifer Van Houten, and others. As I understand it, they're going to post our report up onto their website soon. Thanks to Lee Daniels and the folks at the Virginia Tech Soils Lab for all their work, and then all of these folks here who were very, very important at giving us site access, but also reviewing our logic behind our research and particularly our study design. And then a special thanks down here at the bottom to Wes Hudson, Rob Atkinson, and Mike Rolband for being peer reviewers for the document. And thanks to Dakota. This is the best picture I have of Dakota Hunter, by the way. I'm just kidding. There he is right there. Dakota did the yeoman share of the wetlands work and worked hard at synthesizing all these data. So I probably have not left time for questions. And what I'd like to say is folks are welcome to contact me. You can find me, I think most folks have my email address, but you can find me on the William & Mary website, and I'm also at DeBerry@wm.edu, and then also at VHB, my VHB address as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it. So I know we went a little long, but we did have a large portion of our attendees stay. And so thank you for your engaged interest. There's a note to the panelists and attendees in the chat about visiting our website. This is the third of 5 presentations over our lunch webinar. The next will be the antecedent precipitation tool by Dr. Wes Hudson, Army Corps of Engineers, and Eli Wright from Timmins Group, and Timmins will be hosting that. So big thanks again to VHB for hosting this event. Thank you, Mitchell. Thank you, Doug, for your presentation. Really interesting stuff. We don't have time for questions, but definitely worth some more discussion. So I look forward to that in the future. Thank you all. Take care.